Think of inflation like this. If Russia mobilizes a little bit of their military, then Russia's enemies have to mobilize a little bit of their military to guard against Russia. But because all of Russia's enemies have just called up some men, Russia has to mobilize some more men, so the cycle continues. The Triple Alliance is more, and then the Entente is more, and it spirals out of control. If that analogy is like normal inflation, then hyperinflation is Russia going all in on day one and mobilizing 20% of their population, immediately starting the Great War, which it did in real life. Of course, that analogy isn't one-to-one. No analogy is one-to-one, but you get the point. There is escalation because one guy decided to do something that everyone else must respond to. We have to worry about inflation today because one guy decided to do something drastic. That guy would be the Federal Reserve, the demonic incarnation of international, irrational, binational, and multinational global finance in America, which is already the demonic incarnation of democracy. They decided to print 1/3 of our entire money supply in a single year. If you aren't ready for hyperinflation, then buckle up, bucko, because we're about to experience man-made horrors beyond your comprehension. Not even the not-safe-for-life version of economics known as Brazil will match this coming dumpster fire. If you don't believe me, that's okay, because what's coming will force you to believe. This video will prove to you that hyperinflation is among us, so keep watching because I won't hold back any punches. How we got here. Because of C-19, the government decided it must be a good idea to confine everybody to their homes for months over something that has a death rate of less than 99%. What the confinements did is make the economy take a slam dunk into the pavement. Since the economy was dead in the water, nobody was making enough money to survive, so the government had to step in and give stimmy checks to everyone, like trying to keep a terminally ill patient alive by giving them cocaine. A lot of money went into bailing out companies who suffered from C-19. Some money went to the government, and the smallest piece went to the desperate people who suffered the most out of all three parties. But where did all this money come from? It's not cheap to give $1,000 a month to all citizens of Canada, and the United States also. The US government spent something like $4 trillion on stimulus payments, Canada $240 billion. For once and maybe forever, the US spent more of its GDP per capita on welfare than Canada, as America spent 26% of its GDP, while Canada spent only 17%. How is it even possible to produce 26% of your GDP out of thin air? Well, the government has a trick, and it's a trick that has been used to great effect by Germany, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. It's called printing money. But why does printing money matter? Here's an analogy. Let's say this gross neckbeard wants to buy 100 copies of Bandai Namco's newest hit title, House of Ashes. The reason he does that is because in the future, the original copies of House of Ashes will be exceedingly rare, so this neckbeard scalper can sell them at a huge markup of $300. But what happens if Bandai Namco decides to fuck on him and make millions of copies of the original? Well, the price of the original will go down by a lot, so the scalper has just lost a huge amount of money even though he has physically lost nothing. In total, the games were valued at $3,000, now they're valued at 30 cents. It's the same thing with inflation. The government fabricates money so your retirement savings will become worthless and you have to work until you perish from overworking. So that's how inflation affects you. Your money will be worth less. Inflation and deflation happen all the time, so what is there to worry about? Well, if it were to happen that we printed 30% of our entire money supply in a single year, there will be hyperinflation. Good thing we actually did that and we are fucked. The famous example of how bad hyperinflation can get is mid-century Germany, where you had to bring a wheelbarrow full of bread to buy one loaf of money. I know some people will take this whole thing as me putting the economy before the people, and to that I say, a lot more people will die from a Great Depression than C-19. Some people may be in disbelief. They may think, how in the world could our leaders make such a tremendous mistake? As my man Osho said, democracy basically means government by the people, of the people, for the people. But the people are retarded, so let us say government by the retarded, of the retarded, for the retarded. Our government is retarded, that's why they made that decision. I imagine that you, the educated viewer, are wondering what the ramifications of our government's decisions are. The ramifications. People are saying that the consequence of these decisions is stagflation, and those people are right, sort of. Stagflation is when there isn't enough economic activities to keep a lot of people working, but there is enough that prices keep rising. Enough activity to inflate, but not enough to employ people. The current situation is worse. We are slowly sliding into a recession and a coming depression. All the prices of goods and services have increased dramatically. The price of wood is up 260%, and metals are up something like 200%. Wages are rising because nobody wants to be a wagey when they're literally getting more money to stay at home. Unemployment is probably somewhere around 15%. Officially, they say it's 6%. Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, said it's around 10%. The thing about the official statistics is that they come from a Bureau of Statistics, and they started discounting people who were unemployed for 18 months in 1994. No one counts them, and when you factor that in, it's more like 25%. America is near Spain levels of unemployment. Inflation is officially at 4%. While making this video, it jumped to 6.6%. Other sources say it's 8%, but regionally between states, it can be 9 to 15%. Another thing that is worrying is how organizations are buying physical assets. Like, have you ever thought about being a homeowner? Fuck you. BlackRock doesn't want you to. BlackRock, the pension organization, is buying up homes that are over 40% of their asking price, which is annihilating any opportunities for millennials or zoomers to become homeowners. The reason they're doing that is because they know the US dollar is on the verge of hyperinflation, so they need value-oriented assets in place of growth-oriented assets. Between the inflation spike this summer, unemployment growing, and companies buying physical assets, the timeline is tracking pretty closely to what doom posters like me have been saying. Fairly soon, countries and states will end their stimulus checks, so people are going to start flooding back into the labor market, taking those hiring bonuses and higher wages, which will in turn cause more inflation because there's more economic activity. And on top of that, with that new child credit stimulus, there's going to be some trouble in the hood. Useless puppets of the American empire say all the time hyperinflation will never happen because America is exceptional and can never do something wrong. These slaves of the regime will never admit the fact that their country is in decline. How delusional do you have to be in order to think that normal inflation, not even hyperinflation, won't happen when we've printed 1/3 of our money supply in a single year? Chances are they don't actually believe their crap. They're being paid for the newly printed money to tell government-approved lies. There are two main arguments against hyperinflation happening. The first is that the economy is moving into a post-inflation age because of all this new technology. The second is the idea that the US government knows what it's doing and can never make a mistake. The former line of argument is at best optimistic because it assumes that so much has changed in 20 years that the entire paradigm has shifted into post-currency. The latter is pure cope, considering the absolute idiots who occupy the government. The idea that there won't be any inflation, let alone hyperinflation, comes from the media, which is the propaganda arm of the US regime, telling people to relax and stay calm. The Russians are only 50 kilometers from Berlin, and actually, we're developing miracle weapons to stop them, so relax. What the government needs to do in order to halt hyperinflation is to increase interest rates to around 20%. The interest rates are universal rates that you have to pay on loans. It's actually more complicated, but all you have to know is that if the Federal Reserve raises the interest rates, everyone pays more on their loans. Here's an example of how the government raised the rates to stop inflation. In 1979, the Shah of Iran was unduly overthrown by seething democracy cucks. That caused Iran to stop exporting their massive oil reserves because they were in conflict. Oil prices started going up precipitously, and that caused runaway inflation with the US dollar. The Fed saw what was happening and pulled the trigger. They made the interest rate 21%. When that happened, the economy suffered a severe recession. Credit dried up, people simply cannot afford to take loans out at 21%. Their businesses don't make enough money to service that interest rate. When you raise interest rates to that level, the economy stops, and when the economy stops, there's no inflation because there's no economic activity. The reason the Fed could do that is because the US wasn't in so much debt, they could afford to pay that much interest. Here's the deal, the interest rate right now is around 1.5%. The US is $28 trillion in debt. They spend $378 billion to simply service that debt. That's around 8.5% of the federal budget. So, as a matter of fact, If the Fed raised the interest rates to the level necessary to stop hyperinflation, spending on interest would consume over 100% of the US budget. Of course, the US simply cannot have more of its budget than it has, so the United States will go bankrupt. But the Fed has a way of avoiding that situation entirely. So, what might be done is that Jerome Powell comes up with a fancy new idea called quantitative shitting, not to be confused with quantitative pissing or quantitative easing, which allows the government to print lots of money to not only service its debt, but also give money to the worried people who are finding it harder and harder to live under these deteriorating conditions. And while that method of bailing out a sinking ship may seem short-sighted and arrogant, you have to understand what's at stake. If the dollar breaks, the economy collapses, not only the US, but every single nation on Earth will undergo a recession that hasn't been seen since, well, this might be the biggest one in history. The country who will be least affected will be Best Korea. Protectionism wins again. Another argument which I've seen is a little weird. It goes like this. Inflation only happens when the country is in turmoil, and because our countries aren't ganked, inflation won't happen. And to prove this, they bring up Weimar Germany. They say that Germany only went through hyperinflation because of the cost of World War I and Versailles. But the thing is, Bulgaria and Hungary also went through World War I and suffered far more than Germany did, and had to pay reparations too. Yet, only Germany undertook hyperinflation. Why? Because Germany was the only one out of the three to print trillions of marks, not Hungary or Bulgaria. That isn't to say that inflation can only happen if you print more money. For example, the Dixie dollar became almost worthless near the end of the war because it became increasingly clear the CSA wouldn't exist in the near future. So, if situations unrelated to the currency can affect its value, what major events happened in the past year that broke the economy? No, I can't think of anything. So what's the solution to all our problems? Monarchy. No, wait. Any solution to hyperinflation is difficult. One way is to make a new currency, which, as you would suspect, is not an easy thing to do, and is a last resort. Introducing a new currency seems to be the most effective way to stop it, although not always a sure solution, because the government can just fuck that one over too. Another way was raising the interest rate, but that is literally impossible now without going bankrupt and crashing the world economy. But, unironically, under a monarchy this whole debacle wouldn't happen because monarchs have to think into the future when making policies. Politicians can just ruin the country and hightail it out of office without consequence. Monarchs have to be there from beginning to end, so the idea of breaking the currency to make a quick buck is something you would never do. Well, some kings did that, but those guys were dumb. Debt in general also wouldn't be a great problem. A lot of democracies today have a debt to GDP ratio of over 100%, because politicians can just borrow money and not think about how to pay it back because when the time comes to pay it back, they'll be out of office. Monarchies have to manage their debt because everyone in power now will still be in power when reckless borrowing harms their country. I'm sorry, I just don't know how to solve this. All I know is Amogus and anime. I would like to thank you, the viewer, for watching this highly informative economic video essay that took a deep dive into how we are all doomed and our leaders are dummies. If you like this video, like, comment, and subscribe.